The first day of work is supposed to be exciting, nerve-wracking maybe, but nothing more than a few awkward introductions, some paperwork, and getting used to the new routine. But for some, it's the beginning of something much, much worse. Sometimes a job is not just a job. Sometimes the walls of a workplace hold secrets. Sometimes the people around you know something you don't. And sometimes you were never supposed to be there in the first place. These are real stories of people whose first day on the job became a nightmare they could never escape. Story 1, the night shift. Caleb had never worked a night shift before, but when he landed a job as a security guard for an old office building, he figured it would be easy. Just a few rounds, some camera monitoring, and getting paid to sit around. No big deal. The building itself was strange. 8 floors, but only the first 5 were in use. The top 3 levels had been abandoned for years. Nobody gave him a straight answer about why. They just aren't in service anymore, his manager told him. No need to go up there. That was his first red flag. His second red flag? The cameras. Each floor had surveillance, except for the top 3. The monitor for those levels only showed static. They haven't worked in years, his co-worker shrugged. But that night, as Caleb settled in, something strange happened. At 2:13 a.m., one of the static-filled screens flickered. For a second, just a second, there was an image, a hallway, a flickering light, and a figure. Caleb's stomach dropped. He leaned closer. The image vanished, returning to static. His radio crackled. A voice came through, but it was distorted, like someone speaking through water. Come up, come up. His hands turned ice cold. He checked the main entrance. Locked. No one had come in. Then the elevator dinged. He turned his head, heart pounding. The door slid open. It was empty, but the button for the 8th floor was pressed. A slow, suffocating dread crawled up Caleb's spine. He knew he shouldn't go. He knew something wasn't right. But before he could react, the doors began closing. And inside the elevator, for just a brief moment, a shadow moved. Something had pressed that button. Something wanted him to come up. He ran out of the building and never came back. The next morning, his manager called. Why did you leave? Caleb hesitated. The 8th floor? I saw something on the cameras. Someone called me on the radio. Silence. Then, in a low voice, his manager said, That's impossible. The cameras on those floors don't work. And your radio? It was never connected to an outside channel. Story 2, the basement worker. Isaac never expected much from his new job. He was just a temp, hired to do some basic inventory work in the basement storage room of an old department store. The place had been around since the 1940s, a relic of another time, with creaky floors and a history no one really talked about. His supervisor, an older man named Gary, barely gave him instructions. Just check the boxes, log them in the system, and don't go past the 3rd aisle, Gary muttered. Why? Isaac asked, half joking. Gary didn't laugh. He just stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. Just don't. Isaac didn't think much of it. The basement was huge, rows and rows of tall metal shelves stacked with forgotten inventory. The air was thick with dust, and the dim, buzzing fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly yellow glow. For the first few hours, nothing happened. He counted boxes, logged numbers, did exactly what he was told. But as the night dragged on, a feeling crept over him. A feeling that he wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense of being watched. That prickling unease at the back of his neck. Then, The noises started. A faint rustling, a shuffle of movement. Isaac turned his head quickly, scanning the aisles. Nothing. He brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But when he returned to his work, a box had moved. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, but it hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. He picked it up. No label, no markings, just an old, battered cardboard box. Curiosity got the better of him. He pulled at the lid. "Don't touch that." The voice made him jump. Gary was standing at the entrance, his face pale and tight. Isaac dropped the box, his heart hammering. "What the hell, man?" he stammered. "You scared the crap out of me." Gary didn't answer. His eyes weren't on Isaac. They were locked on the end of the aisle. Isaac turned, and his stomach dropped. There was a shape, just barely visible past the third aisle. Tall. Wrong. It wasn't standing. It was hanging, as if suspended by something unseen, its limbs slack, its head tilted at an impossible angle. The air was suddenly thick, suffocating, like the whole basement had sunk into a different kind of reality. Then it twitched. Isaac didn't remember running. He didn't remember how he got back upstairs. But the next thing he knew, he was outside, gasping for breath, the cold night air burning his lungs. Gary followed moments later, locking the door behind him. His hands were shaking. "You opened something you shouldn't have," he whispered. "It's been locked down there for years. Don't come back." Isaac never did, and the department store shut down a few months later. No explanation, no final sale, just gone. Story 3, the hotel maid. Mariana's new job seemed simple enough. Clean rooms, change linens, restock toiletries. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just a mid-tier place off the highway, the kind of place travelers stop for a night before moving on. She had heard the rumors. Of course, every hotel has them. Stories about guests who never checked out, whispers about certain rooms the staff avoided. But she needed the money, so when the manager told her, "Never go into room 308 alone," she just nodded and got to work. Her first few shifts were uneventful. The usual mess, unmade beds, empty bottles, the occasional forgotten phone charger. But then one afternoon, she was cleaning the third floor when she noticed something strange. Room 308's door was slightly open. The "Do Not Disturb" sign hung from a knob, swaying gently, though there was no breeze in the hallway. She hesitated. She knew she wasn't supposed to go in alone, but she also knew that guests sometimes forgot to check out, and if she didn't clean the room, she'd get in trouble. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. "Housekeeping." Silence. She knocked again. Still nothing. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was freezing, colder than it should have been. The air smelled stale, like something had been locked away for too long. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in dim light. Then she noticed the bed. It was made perfectly, tucked so tightly it looked like no one had ever slept in it. But on the pillow, an imprint, like someone had been lying there just moments ago. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly moved to restock the towels, tried to ignore the unease creeping over her. But then, the bathroom door creaked open. Her breath caught in her throat. The lights were off inside. She could barely see past the doorway, just an empty sink and a darkened mirror. Then she saw it, a figure, not reflected in the mirror, standing in front of it, motionless, watching her, her body locked up in pure terror. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure didn't breathe, didn't flinch. It was just there like it had always been there. Then The door to the hallway slammed shut behind her. The lights flickered, and the figure moved. Mariana didn't think. She ran, bolted out of the room, down the hall, nearly tripping over herself as she reached the stairs. When she finally told the manager what happened, he just sighed. "You went in alone, didn't you?" She nodded, shaking. The manager rubbed his temples. "That room hasn't had a guest in years. We don't rent it out anymore." Mariana quit the next day, but to this day, she swears. As she ran out of room 308, she heard a whisper behind her, "You made the bed wrong." Story 4. The Late Night Janitor. For Alex, working as a janitor at the university library seemed like the perfect gig. The pay was decent, the work was easy, and best of all, he got to be alone. No noisy customers, no annoying coworkers, just silence. Or at least, that's what he thought. His shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 5 a.m. His main job was simple: clean the study areas, vacuum floors, and make sure all the lights were off before locking up. The library had 3 floors, but the 3rd floor had been closed to students for years. Renovations, his boss had said, but Alex never saw any work being done. And yet, something always felt off about that floor. The first time he noticed it was during his 2nd week. He was mopping near the staircase when he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, coming from the 3rd floor above him. He froze, his grip tightening on the mop handle. No one else was supposed to be here. He grabbed his flashlight and hesitated before calling out, "Hello?" Security. Silence. Then a thump, a heavy sound, like a chair being dragged across the floor. His stomach twisted. He knew the building was old, and old buildings made noises, but this wasn't settling wood or a gust of wind. This was movement, against his better judgment. He climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the quiet. When he reached the top, the air felt different. He had cleaned this floor once before, just quickly dusting and wiping down the desks, but now, standing there, it felt wrong. The rows of bookshelves stretched into the darkness, their spines like teeth in a gaping mouth. The long wooden tables were empty, the chairs neatly tucked in. Nothing seemed out of place. But then he noticed it. One chair, pushed back slightly, facing the staircase, like someone had been sitting there, watching. His pulse quickened. He took a shaky step forward, and the lights flickered. For a brief second, the entire room was swallowed in darkness. Then, a shape, a shadow, too tall, too thin, standing at the far end of the room. Alex's breath hitched. He pointed his flashlight, but as soon as the beam hit the space, nothing. The room was empty. His heart pounded against his ribs. He was done. He turned on his heel, heading straight for the stairs. And then the whisper, "Why are you leaving so soon?" right next to his ear. The flashlight slipped from his fingers, clattering against the floor. He didn't stop to pick it up. He ran, bolting down the stairs 2 at a time, out of the library and straight into the freezing night air. He quit the next morning. The library still hires new janitors, but they never last more than a few weeks. And sometimes, late at night, students swear they hear footsteps on the 3rd floor, even though it's supposed to be empty.